This is Clark the Knife, aiming to give you the most helpful knife reviews on YouTube. And today, we are looking at the Benchmade 945. My last review of the Surge Slip 5 was pretty negative. This is going to be a very positive review. This is a knife with a lot of fans, and I am now counting myself among them. This is a highly recommendable knife that is really good, especially once you sharpen it to get the best out of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This review is going to move in 3 parts. First, we're going to go through some specifications, do some size comparisons, all that typical stuff. Then we're going to talk through the overall design of the knife, what I like, what I feel neutral about, what I don't like. And then we're going to conclude by putting it on a 10-point scoring system that should really help highlight where this knife is strong, where it is weak, and over time, we'll build a database that helps us compare these knives to each other. We're back on the marble background. And this is V1, but we are bringing in straight from your classroom in the 90s, overhead transparency technology. I'm going to change the format of this a little bit going forward, and obviously my lighting isn't optimal, but let's see if this helps us proceed at a faster clip. So let's get into the review here. The Benchmade 945 specifications. This is a $230 knife that is made in the USA. We will, of course, talk about that price. Everybody knows about the quote-unquote butterfly tax. But it is made in the USA. It has Benchmade's warranty. It has all those usual things you would expect. Your blade length is 2.92 inches long. Blade thickness is 110 thousandths or 0.11 inches. This one here is S30V, though you can also get this in S90V if you're willing to pay quite a bit more. 6.76 inches overall for the whole knife. It's only 2 ounces, so very light, well below an ounce per inch of blade length. And like most axis locks, this is running on washers. Let's just take a quick look at this. You got, as anybody who knows Benchmade knows, this is the smaller version of the 940. And you've got that signature Osborne shape on the handle here. Big old flat, big hump on the back, and then you've got these scallops right here with a flat across the middle and this little cutout piece. It's just a very distinctive looking handle design. It's very thin, but it has enough sways and curves that it fits nicely in the hand, and this really is just a shrunk down version of that 940. This here is in your sort of green, it's almost a powdery coating aluminum. You can see it scratches off relatively easily with use. You'll see some very beat up 940s out there. This was not the first version of the 945 that came out, but it is readily available now. Black hardware all over the place. You got your axis lock bar right here. You can see your Omega spring right next to it. Typical axis lock action, even though it's on washers. Free dropping, free opening, which is just a function of the fact that your axis lock, there's just not as much friction on the blade, not as much rubbing during that motion as there is with something like a traditional detent for a liner lock and frame lock. Little bit of jimping here, a little bit of jimping down there, not any jimping anywhere else on the knife. You've got these purple back spacers here, which is an homage to the purple back strap on the full-size 940. Black and clip here, I believe they're still parkerizing their clips. This could be DLC, but it doesn't really look like it. Again, black hardware on this side. And then, oh, by the way, blade is, in my instance, perfectly centered. And then you've got the signature blade shape. Again, this is a shrunk down version of the 940 blade. And this, per Osborne's own design sort of recommendation, and you've probably heard this many times if you've watched any 940 or 945 reviews, this is a reverse Tonto that's sort of made as a utility tool as much as a knife. What you've got here is a not very tall blade. Big flat, little bit of belly starting about halfway through the blade here. Relatively low tip. It's pretty much even with the pivot, but this is such a narrow knife that it ends up feeling quite low. The blade, full blade stock thickness is carried probably 5/6 of the way out, all the way out to here. There's this big swedge, which looks fantastic, looks very distinctive, but and hides the fact that this is full thickness all the way out to here. That also means that your tip is quite thick as well. relatively shallow flat grind here. Actually, not even relatively. This is, I mean, there's just not much space to drop as a consequence of the fact that this is a saber grind on a not very tall blade. And then, again, flat grind here. It is a relatively aggressive flat grind in that it tapers pretty quickly, but there's just not that much space for it to taper. Now, again, this tip here in particular with all that stock, this is really meant to be a utility tool. And when I have been carrying and using this 945, I have used it as such. This is a knife design that is meant to do all the stuff you're not really supposed to do with your knives. It's meant to be used to pry. It's meant to be used as a screwdriver. It's meant to be used to, pull out staples, all that kind of stuff that people say is stupid stuff. This blade is kind of designed to do it. And that's sort of, as I understand it, Osborne's design philosophy with the full-size 940 was to make something that was a tool that wasn't just a knife, but that was something that you would carry that would do a lot of different jobs. Now let's pull this out and do some quick size comparisons here. So first, the most similar, a very similar knife is going to be your small Sebenza right here. Very similar in length, very similar in blade thickness, very similar in overall thickness. And very similar sort of in design philosophy that these are high utility small knives. Now, one thing that the 945 definitely has on the small Sebenza, and the small Sebenza is already a very easy knife to carry, but this thing, the 945, even smaller when folded up, and so even smaller in the pocket than the small Sebenza. Let's bring out the PM2, and you can see the PM2 absolutely dwarfs the 945. You can fit most of the 945 in just the handle of the PM2 without getting, too far into the blade there. Blade stock is thinner. It's about half the weight of the PM2. It's also thinner, about half a scale thinner than the PM2. So, I mean, the PM2 is not a small knife, but it certainly makes the 945 feel tiny. And then just one other comparison here to bring out a Hinderer. Here it is compared to your Hinderer Eclipse. Again, your full-size knives are all going to dwarf the 945 here. Now, let's talk about what I like, what I am neutral about, and what I don't like about the 945. So again, tip to tail here. You've got this even though it's a super distinctive looking design, you can feel the focus on utility across the board with this knife, especially with the handle. Let's just talk about overall fit and feel, or overall feel, ergonomics, how it's used before I get into the pros and cons here. So this handle, it's a classic design, and there's a lot of really smart details to it. You've got a pretty subtle swoop here. It actually does sort of swoop out a tiny bit there. You feel it more than you see it. And there's a relatively big swoop on the back. What that means is that this is a 4-finger grip for my, size large gloves hands. And this swell on the back fits neatly into your palm. And then the rest of your fingers just sort of sit right below, right along this bottom. These chamfers here, especially in this chalky feeling aluminum, give your fingers a nice place to land, and even this chamfer back here will roll right into your palm. And it ends up feeling like you get sort of the easy hand feel of a contoured knife while still having some of these sharper edges that help prevent it from rotating in the hand. This ends up feeling quite secure. This saber grip here is a really nice grip. It just feels like a full-size knife almost. You can see it's fitting entirely in my hand, and it doesn't want to move. At the same time, I can pinch up on the blade very easily, and did quite frequently. I can even put my thumb and pointer finger on this thumb stud, provides a nice little place for purchase, and use that to drive this knife in, poke it around, even sort of grab into it this way, get my fingers past the thumb studs. Just really easy to grab, scrape, do all that kinds of, again, stuff you should do with your knives and stuff you shouldn't do with your knives with this nice little blade. And because this knife is so not tall, because it's so skinny this way, even though there's a decent bit of belly, this almost feels like a Warncliffe a little bit when you bring it down, because that tip is relatively low, and especially it's relatively low relative to where your hands are. So your tip is only a tiny bit above your fingers, so it's very easy, especially when you get your finger all the way up on the blade here, to just take that tip down and do your drag cuts, your slicing cuts, things like that. Ends up being a really nice knife for all of those utility cuts, while still having a bit of curvature, a bit of belly, a bit more versatility that you sometimes don't get in Warncliffes. Because, Warncliffes are often great at those quote-unquote utility cuts, but can struggle a little bit in your longer slicing cuts. One of the benefits of the narrow blade here, and the relatively, the thin blade, and the fact that they kept the tip low, is you still have some belly. So when I'm pushing this through a cardboard box, pulling this through a branch, something like that, I still have a curve that will stay in the cut. I still have a bit to slice with without having, that some of those big curves, those big clip points, those big blades with, your tip way up here, which are awesome at those sorts of cuts, but can struggle in your utility cuts when you've got to, bring your wrist all the way up. And again, flow through design here on the 945 with your back spacers. Those cartridge liners to hold the axis lock are going out to about here. They're relatively small. They are steel, but because this is an aluminum frame with just a bit of steel in there, and because it's a relatively lean blade, that's why this comes in very light. So now let's get into what I like, feel neutral about, and don't like about the 945. The most impressive thing about the 945, in my experience, is its carry profile. Again, I'll bring out my small Sebenza here, and the small Sebenza is a knife that carries great in the pocket. This is a ton of knife for not that much space, but you can see, especially when it's folded up like it would be in your pocket, you can see the 945 is significantly smaller than even the small Sebenza. It's a little bit thinner, just a little bit, imperceptibly almost, but it is a tiny bit thinner. Blade stock's about the same, and especially with these curves, with the way the frame curves, you can see it just ends up taking up less space in the pocket than your Sebenza, and curves are naturally easier to fit your hand by, things like that. You combine that with the fact that this is a 2-ounce knife, and very much feels like a 2-ounce knife. This is a knife that disappears in the pocket. This is one of those knives that when I have it in my pocket, I sometimes almost forget that I'm carrying a knife. I have worn this in gym shorts all day, no problem. I've worn it, running around, moving around. It doesn't swing in my pocket. It doesn't take up space. It doesn't ever feel clunky. I can put whatever else I want in my pocket. This thing takes up no space at all to carry. It's got one of the best carry profiles of any production knife that I have used in quite a long time. Which brings us to our second big pro, which is that this reverse Tonto blade shape works extremely well as a utility blade, meaning as a blade that does everything pretty well and can also do some things that a lot of knives aren't designed to do. So again, this reverse Tonto here, and I've already talked about this blade quite a bit, but you got big old flat, little bit of belly, lot of thickness carried out to the tip, though at the very tip it does get pretty acute. This knife can be used as a screwdriver. You can just shove the tip in there and use it to turn. I've used it for both Phillips and flathead screws. You can use it to pry. You can get your little tip in there and pry things apart, pull staples up, things like that. The tip works really nicely for that. It is durable enough that you don't feel like you have to worry about breaking it. And of course, it can be used for cutting stuff. And because of everything that I talked about a couple minutes ago, this blade shape is not perfect at anything. It's not going to do your, table cuts as good as a Micro Jimbo. It's not going to do your big slicing cuts as well as a, Demco clip point or something like that. It's not going to break down cardboard boxes like your PM2. But it will do everything that you need to very well. And there is nothing that I have tried to use this knife for other than, there are a few things where just the fact that it is a 3-inch blade, you're going to struggle to cut anything that is more than 3 inches thick. If you've got a big fat piece of styrofoam, don't use a 3-inch blade for it. But barring those limitations, if you're trying to hack down, a tree limb, don't use a 3-inch blade for that. It's been great in the garden. It's been great around the house. And honestly, it has been really cool and really fun to carry a blade that has those extra utility functions, that I feel comfortable using it to pull out a staple, using it to, just tighten a screw a little bit, stuff like that. I have found myself using it for all of that stuff quite regularly. It's been cool. It's been fun. You combine that with that teeny tiny carry profile, and this ends up being a multi-tool that you carry in your pocket as much as a knife, while still being quite effective as a knife. It's fun, it's interesting, it's not quite the same carry experience as any other knife I've got in the collection right now. Next thing that's great, the action. This is a typical modern axis lock from Benchmade. My particular instance has no blade play up, down, or sideways. Most of the Benchmades I've handled that have come out in the last couple of years, that has been the case. And it's just the nature of the axis lock. These are free dropping knives. The placement on the Benchmade thumb stud here is very natural. The detent is, your typical axis lock detent. It's light and springy, but this thumb stud here grabs your thumb really nicely without sticking out beyond the scales. It is close to the frame, but because of that texture there, it's very easy to put your thumb right there and just pop it out. It fires out with a nice, satisfying thwack. You pull your axis lock back, and it just drops shut. Nice little swing. Sometimes it'll pop out like you see it did just there, but even if it does, then you can just sort of, push it shut. Easy to push shut. You can also, if you want, just pull this axis lock back and flip it out like that. That is fun to fidget with as well. Especially in this small package, this is a nice little fidget toy. The light blade doesn't make it feel ungainly. Honestly, I found myself fidgeting with this much more than I tend to fidget with my knives these days. I generally am using my knives more as utility things than toys these days. I'm kind of past my fidget toy phase in knife collecting, but I did find myself sitting at my desk, flipping this thing back and forth quite regularly, just because it's a fun little action. The action is done really well, and modern Benchmade action is dialed in. I have owned old Benchmades. I know that the action was not always as good as it is now, but these days you can count on Benchmade to have solid, reliable actions on most of their models. And then the last thing is, this is, and it sort of goes to the utility piece, this is a tough little folder. It's 2 ounces, it feels light, but you've got full aluminum scales here. The axis lock, for all its fidgetiness, anytime somebody actually tests the axis lock, it is a stout lock. You can put a lot of pressure on this lock and it will not fail. Side to side. You eventually, if you torque it too much, you will get a little bit of play, but you can put a lot of pressure on this lock and it won't fail. Full aluminum scales with steel cartridge liners around the pivot and the lock here. This is a tough knife. This material, it's going to show those scars here very quickly. And if you've seen old 940s, they'll be scraped to high hell. But these, this handle, you can throw stuff at it. You can put it in a pocket with other stuff. It'll get scraped up, but it won't get damaged. The hardware is all commodity hardware for the most part. If you lose a screw or something like that, it's easy to fix. This is just the blade stock, again, because they carry it out so far. This is a knife that if you need to, pry two pieces of cardboard apart, or separate you got a screw or a nail that's stuck in there and you need to pry it out, or you need to separate 2 pieces of wood, you can jam it in there and do some kind of stupid prying stuff because you've got that blade thickness. 11 thousandths isn't thick, so don't go crazy, but this feels and is a knife that you can use for kind of dumb stuff because it's a tough little beast. Again, it's been fun to carry a knife that is so carryable, so compact, so light that I still kind of feel like I can beat the snot out of. And honestly, the 945, because they kept the same height but shrunk it, feels even tougher than the 940. I've owned a bunch of 940s. I used to love the 940. But with how long the 940 is, it can feel, even though it is tough enough, it can feel a little awkward when you start to do some of that stupid stuff like prying because that blade is so long. You're really far from the pivot and it can sometimes feel a little squirrely. In this 945 size, the whole thing, you're never too far from that pivot, from that point of strength there and from your hands. And so, or at least, no, the pivot's not the point of strength, it's the point of failure, but you're never too far from that point. So it feels like you can push a 945 even harder than a 940. That's mostly in my head, but it feels that way. Neutral stuff. Fit and finish. Benchmade in 2024. Fit and finish is totally fine. Again, I have to make the call out. This is a relatively complex handle pattern. These aren't just slab handles. There's chamfers, actually contours, even sort of rounding, all the way around the edges. Your cartridge liners are flush, but for the little bit sticking out that they want for the jimping. Same thing on the bottom. And even really, the jimping itself is flush. You sort of got to press the fat of your finger in to even feel it. Your screws are all flush. Your pocket clip is nicely seated. This axis lock has been good since I got it. Action has been great. Centering is, maybe it's a hair off to the left, but honestly, I'm only noticing that now if that's the case. The grinds are very well done. Benchmade does some really nice grinds these days. This is my edge. We'll talk about the edge a little bit later. But a nice satin finish, a nice... they do, it looks like, put a little bit of a stone wash on everything afterwards, but they keep the satin a little bit higher up here. Just very nice grinds. And this is a relatively complex grind, too. You've got this swedge here. Like, this is not a simple knife. This isn't some slab-sided full flat grind or something like that. And everything is done well. Everything is put together nicely. There are no issues. It's not trying to be an Oz Roosevelt. It's not trying to be a Norseman. It's not even trying to be a Hinderer. You're not at those levels of fit and finish here, but you're not at that level of price either. And the fact is, Benchmade in 2024, they have had fit and finish issues in the past. My experience with Benchmade, including this knife, is that their stuff is well put together. They're not shooting for anything nuts, but they are at least a little bit complex in their designs, and they're executing everything well. Last neutral thing here, the grind. So again, this is a knife that is meant to be a utility blade. It's meant to be tough as much as it is to be slicey. And the big criticism people have always had of the 940, myself included, is that it doesn't cut that well. The 945, they thinned out the stock a little bit. This is slightly thinner stock than the 940, and that absolutely helps with slicing ability because this blade is just as tall as the 940. So the whole thing is a little thinner behind the edge. What I will say is one of the first things I did after using this for a day or two is I laid back the edge to 17 degrees per side, which, by the way, is what Benchmade sharpens most of their knives, most of their new knives at. When they say it's quote-unquote select tech or select edge or whatever they use, that just really means they're sharpening it well at 17 degrees per side, as far as I can tell. This knife was an okay cutter out of the box, but I didn't love the slicing performance. But once I laid that edge back, once I've resharpened it at 17 degrees per side, this has cut as well as I needed it to. It's still no TRM atom. It's still not a slicing machine. But it is, again, kind of cool that you get a knife that cuts as well as I need it to. It is relatively slicey, again, owing to that relatively thin stock. Even though you've got a shallow grind, they make that grind decently steep. This cuts as well as I need it to for all the tasks I would use. It cuts as well as you'd expect from a small, thin knife, while still having quite a bit of toughness there because of how this is ground. So the grind on this one is not going to be, you're not going to buy this to be the sliciest knife in your collection. That's not what it's trying to be. It is as slicey as it needs to be for its purposes. And again, I think that's kind of cool. In terms of negatives, I actually have nothing negative to say about this knife, and that includes the price, and we're about to get to that. So those are my pros, neutrals, cons on the 945. As you can tell, even before we go to the score, I am a big fan of this knife, and I think it has a lot of features and a lot of things that it does really well, even compared to the competition in 2024, which is impressive considering this is basically an update, and a few years old update by this point, of a design that has been around for who knows how long. Which brings us to our score. Again, I score knives on 10 categories. 5 are fun factor. How enjoyable is this knife to use? This is sort of all your enthusiast stuff. And then I score it on utility. How useful is it? How easy is it to use? How much did I find myself enjoying using it? One thing just to note, I'm going to have a separate video on the scoring system, but this is a full 0 to 10 scale. It's really, really hard to get a 9. You've got to be one of the best knives in the business, production or custom, to get a 9. Very few knives are going to score a 9. Your sort of good knife, your great knife even, is going to score an 8 in any category that it's great in. You've got to be elite to score a 9. And again, only a handful of usually customs are going to get 10s. And at the same time, goes all the way down to 0. There are going to be knives I score on occasion that are going to get those 3s, 4s, things like that. So, with that said, let's go first into our fun factor. Distinctiveness, which is really, the way I think about distinctiveness is, how much is this knife not like anything else on the market? How much, if you want to get this knife, is this really the only option? And for both the 940 and the 945, I have to give them a 9 out of 10 in distinctiveness. The fact is, this Osborne handle shape and blade shape is actually so distinctive and such a signature Benchmade model that it is the rare, common, like legendary design that it feels like the knife community has kind of agreed not to rip off. So many of your other signature designs, whether it's your PM2 or your Sabenza or even some Hinders and stuff like that, you see other knife companies ripping them off in some way, shape, or form. And yes, there have been shameless Chinese companies that have made things that look a lot like the 940, but this reverse tanto blade shape with that swedge up at the top, this particular handle design, the way it's thin here with that swell on the back, with these chamfers, especially in this green aluminum with the purple accents, there's nothing else quite like it. The 940 and the 945 are legendary designs from Benchmade, and if you want a 940 or a 945, there isn't really a knife that I'm aware of that is like, okay, you like a 945, you want something like the 945, but you don't want the 945, get this. You can get things that do the same stuff as the 945, I'm sure, but this design is completely distinct. There is nothing else that quite looks and feels like this in the knife market, at least that I'm aware of. Which brings us to the design. And when I'm saying design, I say sort of how cohesive is the design? How well is it designed in the sense that do the pieces all fit together? Do they support one another? Does the handle work with the blade? Does the blade grind support the blade? Like, how well thought through is this design? And this is clearly another 9, as you would expect from a design as legendary as Osborne's 940 and 945. The fact is, this is a ton of very useful blade that fits into a tiny little package. That's what it's meant to be, and everything about this blade supports that. Again, I've talked enough about how useful this reverse Tonto blade shape is, how smart it is, the way that they carried this thickness out, how it fits in this narrow handle, but despite it being a narrow handle, because of these contours, because of these chamfers, it still fits securely in the hand. And even the design lines is just a cool looking knife. It's cool partially because nothing else looks like it, but it's almost got like a spaceshipy vibe to it. It's weird, it's interesting, it just works. Everything just fits together. I'm finding myself a little bit challenged to put into words exactly why. I think it's just there's so many curves and all the curves are different radii. Like, this feels like a knife that was also sort of drawn by hand. It doesn't feel like it was spat out of a CAD program like so many knives today often do. It's old school. And it's old school. It's been around for a long time. It's well loved. It works. 9 on design. Action. 8 out of 10. The one criticism you can have of an axis lock action, at least in 2024 now, there isn't play in most of these, is you're getting a different detent sensation because it's your omega spring causing that detent there. This is a springy detent on the open. You're not getting a crisp detent break like you would with a Sebenza. That's not even the best example. With something like a Hinderer, where there's nothing and then there's a crisp detent break before it fires out. You don't have that with an axis lock. Some people don't like it, but the fact is, this is an easy thumb stud to access, flies out, drops shut, easy. You can fidget with it all day. You can slow roll it if you want to. You can even just pull the lock back and fire it out. This is a fun action. It's a secure action. It has the benefit of keeping your fingers out of the blade path. Benchmade axis lock actions in 2024 are just solid. They're still some of the most fun knives you can have while also being safe and effective. Fit and finish, I already talked about a little bit. Benchmade is not, so that's an 8 for action. Benchmade is not trying to compete, again, even with sort of the tolerances of something like a Hinderer here. Nothing is as tight as you would expect on this, let alone something like a Chris Reeve, but everything here is executed competently. And that's why it is a solid 7 out of 10. It is fully competent production level execution. Everything is done as well as it needs to be. You won't find any issues with fit and finish in a Benchmade 945 in 2024. And then cool factor, I'm going to call it an 8. There's nothing show-stopping about this knife. There's nothing that is incredible about the blade grind. There's nothing that's super complex about the handle. There's nothing that will wow you. But there's a reason that, if you comb knife Instagram, you see lots of people, showing pictures of their 940s and 945s. Like, because this is so distinctive, especially once this handle starts to get in wear, because it's such a useful knife, that gives it cool factor. Like the utility focus of this knife and the sort of legend around the 940 and 945, the importance that it has had to Benchmade as a company and the history behind it, and the fact that just about everybody in the knife community, if you've been in it for a handful of years, you have probably owned a 940 or a 945 at some point. That in fact makes it kind of cool. There's a universality to it. There's a shared appreciation for it. I call that an 8. It's got a story that a lot of knives don't have. So that gives us a 41 out of 50 in fun factor, which honestly is a little bit surprising, but also not surprising. This is a signature knife design for Benchmade, done, I think, honestly, even better in the smaller package of the 945. I think the design in particular of the 945 is even better than the 940. I would give the 940 an 8 in design. I'm giving this one a 9 because I think the 940 has always felt a little stretched to me, especially toward the tip of the blade. It always feels like I'm kind of reaching a lot. In this smaller package, I feel like I've got even more control over the blade. I think it looks even better. I actually think the 945 is the better version of the 940. Which brings us over to our utility. Cutting, for the reason I described before, it is a 7 out of 10 in cutting ability. You've still got 110 thousandths blade stock. It was good for them to thin it out a little bit. The stock factory edge that they put on this is a bit of a fatter edge, so it doesn't cut quite so great right out of the box. Probably a 6.5 out of 10 out of the box. With this resharpening, it's probably a 7.5. It cuts as well as you would want a small knife to cut. Does it cut quite as well as something like, my Sage 5 or some other very slicey knives in this size range? No. But it cuts as well as I need a small knife to, with that edge laid back. Because it requires a resharpening to get the most performance out of this, and by the way, that's because it's not fat behind the edge. It's not thin, but it's not fat. But because it requires a resharpening to get the most performance, I'm only giving it a 7 in cutting ability. But it's a 7.5 if you have the ability to either get it resharpened or resharpen it yourself. Doesn't even need to be reprofiled, but it does really benefit from a thinner edge angle, a sharper edge angle than the one that it comes out of the box with. Robustness, 7. This is a tough knife. This is a very tough knife for a sub 3-inch knife. The fact is, it's still thin. It's still aluminum, which isn't the heaviest duty metal in the world. And it's still an axis lock, which if you really beat the snot out of it, probably will start to develop some play over time. But the fact is, this is as tough as you need a knife to be, especially a sub 3-inch knife, without being overbuilt. You're not going to stab this through a car door, though frankly, if I'm being brutally honest, you probably could do a lot of really stupid stuff with this knife and it would stand up to it. The axis lock would stand up. The blade is probably thick enough, again, because of that stock, that it would stand up as long as you're not doing, prying out giant, huge, thick staples with the very tip. If you even get it choked up to like there, you can do some decent prying with this blade. The handle is going to hold up. The most important parts are reinforced with seal. This is a reasonably tough knife without being overbuilt. So that's a 7. Carry. Carry is a 9. This came decently close to getting a 10 in carry because honestly, this is probably, especially relative to the amount of usefulness you get out of this blade, this is one of the best carry profiles of any production knife you are going to find on the market. This thing disappears in the pocket. It's one of its best features because it is light, because it is so thin, not thin. It's not big on this dimension either, but because it is so not tall, you can throw this in your pocket with whatever. You can wear this with whatever shorts you want, anything like that. This has the carry profile in terms of presence in my pocket of a legitimately tiny knife, like a Spyderco Dragonfly. I feel it about as much in my pocket as I do the Dragonfly, but you're getting almost 3 inches of blade. There's so much more useful blade here. It's just so easy to carry, and again, it's so fun to have this much utility in your pocket with that small of a carry profile. Solid 9, very close to being a 10. Feel and ergonomics, 8. Again, going back to this handle, and in particular the way the handle and the blade interact. This handle nestles very nicely and neatly in the palm. Very easy to grip onto. I love the chalky feel on this aluminum here. It does give you quite a bit of grip. And then because this blade shape is so versatile, because they keep that tip so low, because the blade is so relatively narrow, it just feels very easy to do whatever sorts of cuts you want, whether that is, dragging it through cardboard, whether that's, cutting a flower stem off, whether that is, hacking down onto something. It's just a handle that whatever way you grip it, it feels like you are in control. It feels like you're right next to that blade edge, like you're in control of that blade edge. It's been very easy to use. There are natural compromises with the fact that it is a relatively neutral handle that is relatively small. You don't have the kind of sublime ergonomic experience, that locked-in feel that you get with even a PM2, let alone something like a Hinderer. But it's a solid 8 in feel and ergonomics, which honestly is way better than most knives in its size range. Last one here, value. Value is a 7. So again, this is a $230 knife, and people are going to bitch, well, it's S30V and aluminum. Why am I paying $230? Well, first off, the one thing I'll tell you, if you care about the $230, just see the secondary market, because this is a $160 knife, even in brand new condition on the secondary market. And at $160, this would be a solid 8 in value. You should have no trouble on knife swap or blade forums finding one of these for $160 in nearly new condition, if not outright new condition. They'll even sit for a little bit. They don't even go instantly at that price. But even at $230, you're getting Benchmade's warranty. I tend to not factor warranties that much into pricing, but the fact is Benchmade does have an excellent warranty. If stuff breaks, you can get it fixed. If an Omega Spring breaks, you can get it fixed. You can even, if you screw up the blade or something like that, they will help you out. The fit and finish is very good. I don't think people quite give enough credit to how good Benchmade's fit and finish are, and how relatively complex some of this machining is relative to, a lot of other brands. I mean, frankly, like, parts of this handle are more complicated in their design, in their machining, than a PM2. These aren't stock scales, but the stock scales have the same shape. They don't have those contours. It's just is different equipment that's necessary to do this sort of handle shape compared to a PM2. And then the fit and finish is as good as you need. It's a little bit more complex than people give it credit for. And then when we talk about the steel here, and I haven't talked about the steel intentionally, S30V is totally fine as a blade steel. Is it a little bit older? Yes. But does it perform well? Absolutely. It's got very good edge retention. If you look at any of the actual data on S30V, the edge retention is very good, especially when it's heat treated well, and Benchmade knows how to heat treat its S30V. The corrosion resistance is good enough for most people in most cases, and the only problem you get from S30V is that it is not the toughest, and it can get a little chippy. That's why having some thicker blade stock here works pretty nicely with S30V. Having a bit of a fatter edge works nicely with S30V. This steel is fine. In fact, in a tough little knife like this, I kind of like S30V even over something like S90V or something like that. I think this S30V is the most utility-focused version of the 945, even if the prices were equal. It gets harder to justify this knife at $270 for the S90V version. That starts to get a little tough, 300 something for the carbon fiber and S90V version. But the fact is, at $230, made in the USA, for everything you're getting here, I'm fine with it. Especially because even though Benchmade's price creep at the top of their lineup with things like the Narrows and the 710 and all that has gotten fairly extreme, their Halo models are getting very Halo-y. With everything else in the knife market, especially the Chinese makers, getting more and more expensive, and Benchmades are getting more expensive too, but they're not getting more expensive quite as quickly as everything else is getting more expensive. They're just creeping up their price incrementally every year. Yes, are there a lot of people that remember the days that these knives were cheaper and wish that they were still as cheap? Yes. But if I look at this knife, if you teleport me, airdrop me into 2024, I know nothing about the history of the knife market, and I'm just looking at, do I like this knife compared to other $230 knives in 2024? Do I feel like this is a good value? Yes, I feel like the fit, finish, materials, and especially the function that I'm getting for $230 is very good. The fact is, if you tell me I want a do-it-all small knife for $230, are there any better recommendations that are either cheaper or around the same price? I mean, there are a bunch that are around the same price, maybe $30-40 cheaper if you get certain versions of the Native or Sage or something like that. But even then, those don't have the carry profile of this one. Like, I can't actually tell you. The Neutron doesn't have the do-it-all utility of this, and that's pretty close to $230 these days anyway. So I would have a really hard time telling you if you want what this knife offers, which is a ton of utility in a vanishingly small carry package with very good fit and finish that is made in the USA. I cannot tell you another knife on the market below $230 that does that better than the 945. And so that leaves us with a score of 79 points out of 100, which I know doesn't mean that much yet because I'm just building this scoring system, but I will tell you, this is going to be one of the highest scoring knives that I end up having on my table, at least for some time. This is a really, really good production knife. This is, as I said earlier, better than the 940 in my opinion. I think it works even better in this small package. The axis lock in 2024 is working really well. This blade grind is shockingly useful. The carry package is hard to beat. The fit and finish is as good as it needs to be. This is just a great knife to use. It's got the history in that design. It's totally distinctive. There's nothing else like it. There's so much to praise about this knife and very little to gripe about. And the one biggest thing you can gripe about, which is the cutting performance out of the box, you can fix with a good resharpening. This is a really, really recommendable knife. And frankly, if somebody were to ask me, like, that isn't a knife person, and they're like, hey, for whatever reason, I've heard it's good to have a good knife. I want to drop around $200 on a good knife, and I want something that I can carry with me all the time. They'll do whatever I want. They'll do whatever I want, whatever I can throw at it. This is going to be one of the best recommendations that I can think of. I would choose this all day over a Para 3. I would... again, I can't think of that many knives. The stuff like the Native 5, stuff like the Sage 5, those are all much larger profiles in the pocket. They don't really compare in how small and easy to carry this is. I can't overstate how much this thing disappears in the pocket and how cool that is to just have it everywhere with you and not even notice it and not even care about what else is in your pocket. It's just a fantastic evolution of a legendary design, which has led to what I believe is one of the best production knives on the market right now. I have been really, really impressed with the 940, and I think that says it all. Hope you found this helpful. 945. I'm sure I've called it the 940 like 10 times in this review. With the 945, I will tell you, I'm doing my 940 review at some point. I've got one coming to me right now. My 940 review is not going to be quite as positive as this 941. Again, I do think the 945 is even better than the 940. Hope you found this helpful. Open to any feedback on the format, whether the overheads work well. I'm really feeling that I'm going to stick with something similar to the overheads going forward. I hate editing videos more than just about anything else. I am not ever going to stick myself to a format that requires me to do any editing. I want to be able to take the video, upload it directly, and that's a constraint I am operating under. So if there's any way that I can, any suggestions on the overhead, anything like that I can do to make these reviews more helpful, please let me know. I am all ears. I would love to hear some feedback. Also, let me know if there are any knives you would like me to review in particular. I do stick almost entirely to US or Western companies. They don't have to be made in the US, but they do have to be almost always, if not an American company, a Canadian company, a German company, a European company, something like that. I just really am not that interested in Chinese companies. The sort of everything that gets pumped out by those Chinese-made companies. But if there is a knife that you have not seen yet and you would like me to review it, drop a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts in general on the 945. Again, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a good one.